I'm Nadi Abusaada. I'm a Palestinian architect and an architectural historian. And I'm currently based at the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture at ETH Zürich in Switzerland. So I'm Palestinian. I grew up there, but it's also the topic of my research. I've been writing about Palestine, specifically its architecture and urban history, for the past 5-6 years. So I actually started my venture into Alami's project back in 2016. I came across it while I was doing archival research, and this was at St. Anthony's College at Oxford, where they have a whole collection of the Arab Development Society. And so that was my first encounter with the sort of more historical materials on the society and its foundations, etc., which really sparked in me the desire to start researching it. And then I wrote a paper. I started writing it in 2016, but only got published in 2021 in the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. And it was one of the earlier, let's say, full analysis of the early phases of Arab Development Society from 1945. So even before the Nakba, the conception of it initially as a land reclamation project, and then how its trajectory sort of shifted with the events of 1948. Well, it's good usually not to go with too many expectations when it comes to historical analysis, because things can be quite surprising. I think one of the most remarkable aspects about this project in architectural terms is the spatial layout, the clear setbacks that were used for a project in the 40s. Obviously, it borrows a lot of the modernist language of architecture that had been known in Palestine and in the region already by the 20s and 30s. But it's reusing it towards a refugee housing program. So I think on the architectural and physical layout and that aspect of the project, I think that's one important side of it. But there's also the social terms in which the project was envisioned, right? That it wasn't just a project of housing. It was also a project that carried with it a certain modernist ethos about the future of Palestinian society, how the Palestinian refugee can reclaim his or her destiny in their own hands rather than depend on foreign aid. So I think that aspect is quite important for us to remember, especially today. I think for me, there's something very symbolic about the complex, and that's the big pool and fountain in the middle of one of the squares. And I think it was important. It's important not just for me, it was important historically also for Alami, because I think it's the one, let's say, architectural element that sort of engendered the spirit of the project, but also the very difficulty of its foundation, which really dependent on the finding of water in a place that where there were doubts around finding water, like the Jordan Valley. So water being at the heart of this complex, I think, is very symbolic, but is very, I think, also indicative of the material significance of water to make the project possible in the first place. Yeah, I mean, of course, one thing we have to take into consideration is that the complex changed incrementally over the years. And one of the things that are worth noting about that change is the shift in the use of materials, starting with houses built with mud, but built according to hygienic standards, which was also, speaking of the whole modernist ethos of the project, which is also significant. But also gradually transitioning into stone, which is not a material used very commonly in a place like Jericho. Only those who could afford stone could build with stone in Jericho. And for me, this transition was not just a question of materials. I think it carried with it a certain message, a message that was contested around the future of the refugee question. Stone is a more permanent material. And once Alami started building with stone in the 1950s and 60s, he had to face quite a lot of challenges from the refugee population, from their surrounding refugee camps. And that, yeah, that tells you a lot about how political certain architectural choices can be, especially when dealing with something as sensitive as a refugee question. So that might not be a full analysis of the project, but it's an element that I think is worth highlighting. Of course, the buildings differ based on functions. You have the smaller housing units, which were supposed to house students and staff working in the project, but also there's there were a whole vocational training center. So architecture that is more akin to the agro-industrial architecture of that period. There's playgrounds, there's there's all sorts. There's a big administrative building that has, that's the one with stone. It has arches and different architectural vocabulary than the rest. Generally, I mean, we can call it a planned project in the sense that there was a certain consciousness of the significance of planning. At the same time, we know very little about the history of that planning, and who was behind it, the agents behind that master plan besides Alami. So I think there's more to be said about the plan and the buildings of that project, I think, and warrants further analysis, actually. Yeah, so of course in the 67 war, the complex got attacked directly and was severely damaged. There were attempts at its reconstruction since, but I think that was when the project actually lost its initial ethos. And with the death of Alami in the 80s, I mean, it was difficult to maintain such a project. There was an initiative by Birzeit University in the 90s to sort of rejuvenate the Arab Development Society project, and it is still functional today, but I would say it's more functioning as as an agro-industrial corporation slash cooperative, if you want. But that is very, very different from how Alami envisioned it in the 1950s and 60s before the destruction. And I think this has in part to do with, our political history, but also general waves in global history when it comes to humanitarianism, when it comes to development aid, because Alami was quite dependent at the end on the Ford Foundation and Oxfam and a few other aid agencies. I think it's really a project of its time, and I would say it would be a stretch to call what is happening today a continuity of that initial vision. Yeah, I mean, before addressing how Al-Mashru can be useful for architectural heritage in Palestine, we need to define what we mean by Palestinian architectural heritage. Because on the one hand, you have the definition, the working definition, that certain groups within Palestine are working towards. And here I would mention Riwaq, especially, which is a center for architectural conservation based in Ramallah. And they have a much more generous interpretation of what constitutes heritage, right? Extending all the way to the 50s and 60s, something that would incorporate at least the initial buildings of the Arab Development Society. On the other hand, you have something like the legal definition of Palestinian heritage, which has been adopted by the Palestinian Ministry of Culture. And that puts a cap on what constitutes heritage in the year 1917. So a year before the start of British colonial rule in Palestine, basically towards the end of World War I, which is a much less generous definition of heritage. Now, the question of heritage is a big debate, I think, both in Palestine and the Arab region today. But one of the things that initiatives like Luwaq point us to is that heritage is not just a dead thing, and it's not just about buildings, right? I mean, the easiest thing to say is, heritage is about artifacts and buildings. But then what's the point of that if it's not being used, if it's not a living heritage and part of the living economy, industry, means of subsistence that people depend on. So yeah, I mean, obviously the Mashru' does have an architectural legacy that I think is worth preserving, but I think it's more than just that. I think it is the spirit of it, its history as an experiment, its history as an alternative to the UNRWA and foreign aid. I think that element is what we need to really highlight when we talk about its heritage, and also the sort of the mutual consideration for refugee resettlement in line with agricultural production. I think these two elements need to sort of be taken together in whatever direction that we take from this point onwards. So in short, yes, architecturally, it's very significant, but it's much more than that. I mean, the issue is that we're talking about preserving something that is actually gone, so that is a lost heritage in a way, and a lost legacy and a lost history in many ways, because of the discontinuity that we mentioned earlier, roughly from the 70s, 80s onward. Now it's, bringing back the dead is a futile project, but there are lessons learned, I think, from what Alami tried to do back then. In fact, Alami himself had written a manifesto right after 1948 called The Lesson of Palestine. He published it in 1949. And in it, he was reflecting on the Nakba of 1948 and the failures of internal failures of Arab society. Obviously, that defeat was a result of colonialism, largely. But it was also, in his manifesto, he identifies some of the fault lines of Arab society at the time. And so when we look at when we take someone like Alami, who is someone reflective, who did learn from history and tried to, not just learn in abstract terms, but also try to apply those lessons into something material and tangible. I think there's a lot for us there. There's a lot of potential. So it's not so much about preservation, nor is it about, recreating what Alami had done, but it's about first knowing this history, and second, learning from it and taking those lessons into the present and future, especially of the refugee crisis, but also of the agricultural problem in the Jordan Valley today and in Jericho. Yeah. Yeah, so it's important to remember that the location of the complex as a frontier, almost separating Palestine from Jordan, truly, affected it throughout its history, right? Because between the period between 1948 and 67, all of the area extending from the Arab Development Society into Jordan was not a border region, right? So this raises the question of what happens to a project once it becomes situated at a frontier, at exactly the line that separates Palestine from Jordan, which actually resulted in the confiscation of some of the land that belonged to the Arab Development Society from the project. So that's just a general, I think, question that we have to take into consideration when we look at the project today. Now, on the other hand, there are features or problems that affect the Arab Development Society that also affect, I think, generally the region it sits in, or the sub-region it sits in, of Jericho and the Jordan Valley. And a lot of that is due to Israeli restrictions. We're talking about a place that has been isolated from the rest of the region in terms of import and export regulations, all put by Israel. In terms of the water problem, I mean, Israel limits the extent to which you can dig for water below the ground level for Palestinians and not for settlers. So that's one thing to take into consideration. Generally, there's a decline in the agricultural sector more broadly within Palestine, which affects also the market where these products have to go to, and so staying competitive while you have competition from the Israeli market, etc. So all of these are elements that directly affect the present of the Arab Development Society project. But also, I mean, I think these are just the most direct problems, but there's a lot of other problems related to land use, to the demography of Jericho, to the surrounding settlements around the city, to the checkpoints, etc. So we can go on and on. I think the limits are quite infinite at this stage. Yeah. I mean, it's tough for me to put down a vision as an individual. I think what needs to happen is that we come together, everyone who has worked on the history of the project or is currently involved in the project, to come together and try to set out a vision for what this project can be. And I think something that brings out the project of this mold of being a merely technical institution or operation that could basically be replaced by any other similar project, into something that is socially oriented and looks out into the place where it's seated, right? I mean, now the project sort of looks inwards. It sort of turns its back against the city in a way. Of Jericho and against the refugee population. But what happens if that gets reversed? If the project looks outward into that community that it's part of, and looks also to its history, right? For lessons learned. I think there's a lot of potential, but it cannot be an individual vision. It would have to be a collective vision necessarily, I think. Yeah, I think the pedagogical and educational element that was very foundational to the project since the start, right? I think that is one way, and very effective way, to bring in the surrounding communities into the complex, right? That vocational training center, which once was the essence of this project. I think something like that, community research revolved around the project, within the project, using the project's resources for things outside of. I think that educational spirit might be one good starting point for something like that.